Hey guys, it's time for the final part 5 of our letters from Christopher discussion on the book. We're starting with chapter 24, which starts with him being arrested. If you'll remember, they already read him his Miranda rights, and now they just have him remove his shirt so they can take photographs of any kinds of injuries or defensive wounds, and they take pictures of his hands as well, and all of this is done right before he's taken into custody. When he's arrested on Wednesday, August 15th, it's around 11 p.m. They're almost done getting Shanann out of her grave. And if you remember, they haven't got the girls out. That's going to be done the next day. But he was arrested and processed and then taken to the Weld County Jail. I will link the video of him being taken into custody below. So after she talks about him getting released to the Weld County Jail facility, the author kind of jumps to something that happened in September. And I'll start by reading what she wrote about it, and then I'll go into what actually happened that's in Discovery. The author writes, "Between the time Christopher was arrested and sentenced, there were things that happened at this house that make a person take pause. There is an opposite to good, it is evil. Evil can present itself in different forms. Strange things connected to the story, such as one evening not long after the murders. The police were called. The neighbors seeing a woman walking around in the garage. There are police cam videos of 4 policemen arriving at the Watts house. Clearly show the garage lights were on. As they opened the front door, they were met with an eerie darkness coming from in the house. They went inside and yelled several times for whoever was in the house to make themselves known. There was no answer. They went to the garage and, with guns drawn, opened the door to the garage and yelled again. When they opened the garage door, however, the lights were off. They searched every inch of the house, but no one was there. There was no way out of the garage without coming into the house without opening the big garage door. But then they would have no way to shut it. It was obvious on the police cam video they felt something too. They kept shining their lights into the darkness over and over. Who turned the lights on? Who turned them off?" And I'm still giving you the author's words here. She goes on to say, "Still another evening at 9:05 p.m., the police were called to the house regarding an unknown person seen going up to the house. Upon arrival, the police advised the neighbor from next door that had video pointed towards the Watts house. The video showed a large black vehicle pulling up to the address, and then an unknown female stepped out of the vehicle and walked up to the door of the house. The police said the woman could not be seen leaving the residence, and the garage lights came on when they had been off. As the police entered the house, they gave loud announcements they were entering, but no one was there. They searched the house again and found no one. They turned all the lights off that were on in the house and locked the doors as they left." She then says, on September 21st, 2018, the police received yet another message from some unknown person who said, "Her deceased daughter's back door is open at her house. This is the home of Shanann Watts." The police walked the perimeter of the home. All doors and windows were secure, and there were no signs of forced entry to the home. Again at 8:50, another call came in to respond to the residence. There were lights on that had not been on earlier. Several police officers responded. They searched the residence again. The lights were on, but they did not see that anything was bothered. They turned off the lights and left, making sure all doors were locked. What or who was playing with this house? Was it something supernatural? Research shows often demons will play with the lights and electrical things. So, okay, that was the author's version, and then there's the version that's actually reported in Discovery. Now, she does have a point. I mean, whatever happened on September 21st is very strange and very creepy. I can maybe think of 2 reasons for it, but I don't know. But I think it's important, if you're going to get to the bottom of something, you have to start with the accurate facts. And what she did here is she took one night, September 21st, and then she split it into 3 different incidents, and that's not accurate. So I have the report out of Discovery, and I'll put it up, and we'll see what really happened. Here's a supplement report from Officer Lyons, and the incident happens on September 21st, 2018 at 6:32 p.m. The dispatch gets a call from Sandy Rusick that she gets a text from an unknown number saying that Shanann's back door is open. So Officer Lyons goes out, walks the perimeter of the home, and sees that the screen in the back is slid open, but the actual door is shut, locked, and there's a security bar in place. So here's where it does get really creepy. As Officer Lyons and Officer Manley are leaving after they've walked the perimeter of the house, they're walking back up and they notice that the garage light is on. And they do not recall that light being on when they got there or when they walked around the house, which they note is really odd, but then they end up just leaving. Later that evening, officers are dispatched out there again because Frank Rusick calls and says that he's talked to the next door neighbor, Nate. And Nate says that the garage lights are still on, and I think that's really odd because the garage lights haven't been on at all in the days leading up to this. And this is where things get even weirder. When officers arrive, Nate shows them a video of a female walking up to the front door of the house. She is not seen leaving the house. Shortly after she gets there, a black SUV is seen slowly driving down the street. They don't observe anyone leaving the vehicle or leaving the house and getting into the vehicle, but they never see the female leaving the home. At this point, they are nervous enough where they call for backup, and I believe there's 4 or 5 officers that come out, and they do have their weapons drawn, and they clear the house. And I'll link the video below, but I will agree with her that they do seem nervous. At this point, the author jumps back to after Chris was arrested and writes, after the authorities arrested Christopher, his family was not allowed to see him or talk to him until the day before the sentencing. Christopher's attorneys flew Ronnie, Cindy, and Jamie to Colorado to see him before he was sentenced. She says his family was told that he had pled guilty to killing his entire family, and that his family feels his attorneys did not make him plead guilty, but they strongly advised him to, all in an effort they told him to save his life. She goes on to say, this did not sit well with Christopher or his family, but for different reasons. He says he had a hard time with it, but did not want the death penalty. His family, not having been told any details, felt like he should not be pleading guilty if Shanann had killed the girls. He told his family he was pleading guilty to all of the murders for a reason. However, he gave them no details, so they went into the sentencing having no idea about the circumstances surrounding them. She talks about how D.A. Rourke said he wanted to seek the death penalty and probably would have gotten it if it wasn't for Sandy Rusick. She does compliment her here and tell her that she's to be commended for that, and it must have been a very difficult decision. The author writes, if it had all not come down the way it did, if they had not arrested him as soon as they did, Christopher says he had decided to plead guilty anyway. Yeah, right. He says to the author that he just had to get past the anger and the memory loss first. In Christopher's own words, however, the morning of the murders did not happen because he just broke into a rage. He may have been angry for sure, but this anger had been building for weeks, some of it for years. He started to plan these killings. Once he started, he was not able to stop it. He became obsessed with it. Chris continues to weirdly plead his case by telling the author that had they not gotten the evidence to arrest him, he already planned on confessing to the murders. He just couldn't remember everything about the murders to tell them. And it was really hard for him because at the time, he didn't feel remorse, but he had to pretend to feel remorse. He doesn't like for people to hate him, he reminds her again. And he even apologized to the agents during the interrogations that he had lied to them. Yet he continues to lie to them in the second interrogation and continues to lie now. He then makes a strange comment to the author, and he says after he was arrested and told his attorneys what he could remember, they were willing to tell whatever he wanted them to tell about the murders. He said that they had some very angry, very stressful times going over this case and what the options were. Now, Chris says he felt heartless, angry, and defiant up until October 1st, when it all broke for him. Chapter 25 is called The Family, and she starts out by talking about how it was for the Watts after his arrest and up to sentencing. Cadle says that when Cindy went in to see Christopher, she asked him if he was sure that he wanted to plead guilty. She says that his attorneys yelled at her and said, "Stop asking him those questions or we will shut this shit down right now." She said that the Watts were really confused about all that was taking place because nothing was explained to them. They were having to come to terms with the fact that the most heinous thing was putting the girls in those battery tanks. Chris had done that. Bearing the pain of that alone was more than they could handle. However, they were confused by his first confession. Unbelievably, in this chapter that includes the title of sentencing, the author never talks about the actual sentencing of Chris Watts. It's obviously a huge part of this case, and since I was there, I'll just fill you in on a couple things that I remember. I mentioned before I don't live that far away, but another woman and I went and we showed up over, I believe it was around 2 hours early to get a place in line and be able to get into the courtroom. And we weren't even the first ones there. We were pretty close to it, but we stood directly behind Shanann's friends. And then the line went all the way through the courthouse and down the stairs outside. There were so many people there. I would say hundreds of people in line to get in and try to see the sentencing. When it was time for sentencing to start, they call all the reporters in first. And then after the reporters in, there was like a handful of seats left. So my friend and I got in and we sat on the Watts side because Shanann's side was completely full. There were so many people that they actually opened a second courtroom as an overflow courtroom. And that one had speakers so that they could hear everything. They just couldn't see anything. Of course, the first thing that sticks out in my mind was seeing Chris walk into the courtroom. And up until that point, I just read about the crime. I had been in groups and things like that. But seeing him in person was surreal. And he looked a lot like he did in the pictures, but he was very quiet and subdued and had his head down. But he also, in my opinion, gave off a very angry, kind of defiant vibe. To say that it was a tense environment is a huge understatement. The whole atmosphere was just very thick and negative and uncomfortable. And as soon as we walked in, they were very clear that we had to have all phones and iPads powered off and put away. And I had my iPad, but I turned it off and followed the directions, but I had it sitting in my lap to write on. And even with that, they made it a point to stare down every single person and make sure that you were following the rules. Listening to DA Rourke describe what happened was extremely powerful and very emotional. So as we were all listening to DA Rourke go through the events of what happened, I will never forget, he started talking about Bella and he said the words, "Bella fought back." And he sat there for a minute for impact, and everyone in that courtroom just either froze or gasped. It was an absolutely horrible moment. No one, including the families, had been told before sentencing about Bella's violent death. So when he went in to describe that, you can't hear it as well on the video or the cameras, but you could hear throughout the courtroom everyone start to sob. And you could hear Shanann's friends and family sobbing next to us and behind us. And it was just absolutely so heartbreaking. Of course, the other devastating thing to listen to during the sentencing was Shanann's family's victim impact statements. And no matter how you feel about the Watts or what's been said afterwards, it was really devastating to hear their statements as well. I mean, in that room, everyone had experienced such loss and was so broken because Chris has just caused so much devastation across both families. About an hour after sentencing, we went across the street to the press conference, and it was just a smaller gathering of the reporters from everywhere and then Shanann's family, and they brought Nicole Atkinson. We sat next to Inside Edition and talked to them for a little bit before it started. We were a little surprised. They had a few names wrong on the case, and we had a brief conversation with them. And then DA Rourke came in and answered some questions. I will link up below if you haven't seen it. When I left there after everything, I had a pounding migraine and felt nauseous and was just physically and emotionally drained. So I can't imagine what the families felt like on a daily basis. Chapter 26 talks about Chris's prison life. Chris tells the author that the night after sentencing, plans were made to take Christopher to Weld County Jail. Chris was in the Colorado prison for 7.5 weeks, during which time he was threatened, yelled at by other inmates, and told ways he could kill himself. They would scream almost constantly at him for a while, until, as he says, they either lost interest, or since he had no reaction, they realized they couldn't get to him, so they just stopped. Had they been able to get to him, though, they would have most definitely killed him. He was on suicide watch, so he was stripped of everything except a paper gown, not even a pillow or a blanket, and only a small pad to lay on a cement floor. He was in a state of extreme trauma from what had happened, and nothing still made sense to him. He talks about his sudden transfer to Wisconsin and how scared he was because he thought he was going to end up at a certain prison. He doesn't say the name of the prison, but I'm assuming he means our Supermax ADX in Florence, where we house El Chapo and a bunch of terrorists. So it's disappointing that he didn't end up there. He tells the author that the food is tolerable, but sometimes he craves things like ice cream or pizza, and he also craves Shanann's spaghetti sauce. Then he goes on to talk about what a great cook Shanann was. The unit that Chris is in is called a pod, and there are about 17 men in his pod, and most of all of them are handicapped. He mentions that he doesn't talk to anyone in prison about the crime. The only people he mentions the crime to are his sister, a friend, and recently this author. Then the author reveals that the murderer of Jamie Kloss's parents and who kidnapped Jamie Kloss, Jake Patterson, is housed in the cell right next door to Chris. And Chris says that he hopes he would cross his path because as a 21-year-old, he has a lot of time to think about and to deal with what he did. So apparently Chris thinks that he can counsel him. Chris is in his cell for most of the day, but he now has recreational time, and he loves when it's good weather because he can go outside for 40 minutes and play basketball, and he says it's really nice to be in the sun and enjoying a breath of fresh air. He spends most of his days reading, and when he's not reading, he's usually writing letters. He receives an enormous amount of mail. Most of it he throws away, but a lot he does answer. He complains that one of the hardest things to get used to in prison is no privacy. She writes that Christopher will never be at a birthday party again, have a birthday cake, or enjoy going out to dinner with his wife for her birthday or their anniversary. He misses things such as washing his car, or mowing the lawn, or feeling the rain or snow on his skin. He'll never go swimming again or grocery shopping. He'll never go golfing or go to a car race with his dad. Holidays are not recognized at the prison, so he will never again get to enjoy or look forward to celebrating an upcoming event. He will never have another love. And I'll interject here and say that this is not in the book, but we now know from subsequent interviews that the author has given that Chris does have a new girlfriend who writes him weekly and is also another very strong-willed woman who quote-unquote defends him like a wife. And I don't know what her name is because, again, this isn't mentioned in the book. In the book, he'll never love again. And then, here we are a couple weeks out and he's got this new girlfriend. So another Chris Watts inconsistency and lie. But there is a reference and a thank you to a Janelle in the back in one of the letters. And so I don't know if that's who it is, but I guess that's a possibility. She writes that on June 22nd, 2019, Ronnie Watts was able to visit Christopher for the first time since the murders. He had meetings in Chicago, and his boss told him to take that opportunity to go see his son in Wisconsin. Both Christopher and Ronnie were elated at the possibility of meeting. They spent 3 hours together in the face-to-face meeting. It was a very emotional meeting, but they were able to hold it together during the time that they talked. And then as Ronnie walked out of the building where Chris was housed, he broke down and completely lost it. He never would have thought he would be visiting his son he raised in prison. On June 25th, 2019, lawyers for Frank and Sandy Rusick called Chris to discuss probate. Chris signed absolutely everything over to the Rusicks. When the conversation with the lawyers was over, according to Chris, Frank Rusick came on the phone and said, "Thank you, Chris," to which Chris responded, "You're welcome, and I love you guys." Frank allegedly responded, "Love you." What a wonderful feeling that is. For the Rusicks still to be able to love or forgive him is such a huge thing, beyond anything most of us could picture if it were us. At the end of chapter 26, the author mentions that Ronnie and Cindy recently received the wallet that Chris had on him at the time he was arrested. He had $13 in it, and she writes, "Is this a coincidence?" Chapter 27 is titled Christopher's True and Final Confession and His Testimony. The author writes, "These letters contain the things that Chris did not share with the FBI or even his family. This is the platform in which Chris was most comfortable to tell all, the only way he would tell all. Including here is also his testimony that was promised to be told for him, in his words exactly." The first letter I'll read to you says, "Dear Frank, Sandy, and Frankie, I'm sorry for the pain and utter anguish that I've caused your family. This is a travesty that I never thought would occur. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico are 4 beautiful souls that will live on forever in heaven and in our hearts. I know you must hate me for what I've done, and honestly, I would be surprised if you didn't. This is a moment in my life that I will never be able to undo, and it rips me apart every single day. I see their beautiful faces, their beautiful smiles everywhere I look. When I read to them at night, I can feel them snuggled up next to me like we were at home. I want you to know that I still consider you my father-in-law, my mother-in-law, my brother-in-law, and that I will love you yesterday, today, and forever. I pray that one day you can have forgiveness for me, but most of all, I pray you can have compassion on my family. They are hurting so bad from all of this, and I know they would love to reconcile if that is something you would allow to happen. I pray every day that both families can meet at the gravesite, hold hands, pray, and talk about great times. Share about birthdays and visits and funny FaceTime conversations. I know this prayer hasn't been answered yet, but I know God is working this request of mine in your hearts. Forgiveness is the start of healing, and I pray you can start that process with my family. Love, Chris. As you guys are probably aware by now, the author is now giving different interviews than what's in the book, and she's giving more information. And she has said, I believe it was last night, on a different YouTube channel, that she is holding back a chapter about Nicole. So she's going on Dr. Oz, I believe it's on November 5th. So who knows what the reasoning is for holding back this chapter? Why not just put it in the book? I mean, that's for you to decide. However, it looks like we're still getting some new information on Nicole, if you want to look at it that way. You can also look at it that way. I mean, we're all interested in it, but at the same time, it's coming from Chris's mouth. You know, just like the Metallica lyrics for the song Battery. Did she ask him to look it up right after? I mean, you're taking the word of Chris. We don't know. Is Chris giving her this really interesting information about this dark stuff that she was into? I don't know. Maybe it's true. Maybe it's not. Unfortunately for Chris, since he's never told the truth, it's extremely difficult to decipher what is BS and what is true. So in the book, Chris tells her, you ask if there's anything I haven't talked about in regards to Nikki. Honestly, I'm not sure what I've said and what I haven't, but this is what I know. She had a small group of friends that she didn't tell me about. They were dark and did some dark things. She didn't tell me a lot about them until the end. She had been involved in an abusive relationship for a few years before, and after that, she removed most of her social media. And she took medications he doesn't know what for. He talks again about the 2 visits, July 4th and July 14th, that we've gone over in the other videos. He talks about the first night that he was in North Carolina with Shanann and how Nikki, regardless of her text earlier that night, was insisting that he makes more time for her no matter what. He also talks about the oxy again, and he says that the reason he researched the 80 milligrams of oxy was that he wanted to see if it would cause her to have a miscarriage, and that based on his research, he thought that it would, and then it didn't work. Chapter 28 is just letters from Chris to his family for their birthdays. And then at the end of chapter 28 is a foreword that Chris wrote for the book. The foreword's pretty long, and it's basically just how Chris has found Jesus. So I'll just read this one short little excerpt from it. It says, so what do I hope for? What do I wait on? What do I trust in? Christ. I had a beautiful life. I experienced beautiful love, but I let temptation steal it away. Darkness can restrain you from making the decisions you should. Darkness can rob you of everything you love. Darkness can blind you from everything you hold dear. Darkness can destroy your soul, but the light can restore it. That light is peace in your heart. That light is the smile and laughs you go home to every day. That light is the love of God in His Son, a love that stretches from the east to the west.
Guess what, girls? Mommy has a baby in her belly. Are you guys excited? Yes? Are you really excited? Oh my goodness. Come give me hugs. Oh. I love you, girls.
I got the baby a hug.
You want to give the baby a hug? I love you, Bella. You're so sweet. Give me a kiss.
Mommy.
Thank you for listening. And because of the strong response we got, we'll be starting our discussion and review of Nicole Kessinger's interviews with kind of a fresh look at it with everything that we know now. Please don't forget to like the video and subscribe.